from the civil applications that we've been talking about to some of the privacy implications of drones or unmanned aircraft systems. To begin with, I mean, if you think about the image that, that Bruno showed earlier of the vegetation, with the cameras and the sensory enhancing devices that he talked about, like the video camera, obviously there's a GPS system on there, thermal imaging devices, high resolution cameras, and remember we saw that vegetation so clearly and with such precision. And we think about turning that camera on people and places that are protected from view at ground level. Well then, I would suggest to you that when I look at images like Bruno's of the vegetation or the wilderness that Dave showed, I feel kind of, you know, calm and interested and intrigued about this technology. But if I imagine that same technology turned on people and places that are protected from ground view, my feelings, my affect about this changes quite a bit. And I suspect, in some of the research that we're starting to look at, some of the respondents' affects suggest that they do too, that people feel more nervous, they're concerned, and they're kind of wondering about sort of the boundaries upon which we can kind of use this technology. And Dave says, you know, I show images like this, I can't write this, people need to see this. Those images, they can be shown and obtained through helicopters and planes, right? We've seen images like that before. But the thing is that the drone imagery is cheap, really cheap, because you can get images like that with some of the more kind of basic recreational drones that are out there. And it's efficient. And so, as you say, there are people with these devices in their hands. They already purchased them. They want to use them. And lots of people want to use them kind of at all costs, even if it's a violation of the law. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the privacy implications, not really so much about the regulations. I suspect that there are people in this room, and actually people on the panel, who've had to navigate their way through the regulations. And Bruno clearly states that they're difficult and they're time-consuming. The only good news to offer there is I think that's going to change in the next several months, and it's going to become more accessible, that commercial operators operating the kinds of drones that we've been talking about will be able to use them a little bit more readily. But there's still a number of hurdles to overcome. But when it comes to the FAA, by and large, their interests are in safety. And they've made that quite clear. But there are a number of groups, a number of different bodies that are concerned about the privacy implications. Because when we think about, and we saw this in some of the images already, drones can capture images that go well beyond the target of anybody's investigation or story or even imagination, right? The aerial perspective is so vast, and it enables us to capture data and to then, like any kind of digital data, store it and disseminate it, like post it on social media, and have it essentially disseminated to hundreds, thousands, millions of people really, really quickly. And so many people are really excited about this technology. And with good reason, because there's so many different applications. And it is a booming, burgeoning industry. There were 4.3 million drones sold in the world last year. And many experts anticipate that there'll be, in this country alone, about 2.8 million drones sold. So that's a combination of recreational drones, more advanced drones like the kind that Bruno's using for his applications and Dave's using, and on and on. So in conjunction with that story, there are lawmakers all over the country very concerned about the implications of this proliferation and the implications that it has on people's personal privacy. And so to just show you a quick clip. This is Dianne Feinstein, right? Senator Dianne Feinstein in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee in 2013. She's actually asking Robert Mueller questions, the then FBI director, about the FBI using drones for surveillance of people. But I'm just going to show you a clip where she's making a statement about her perception of drones at this point in time, about 3 years ago.
If people are concerned about privacy, I think the greatest threat to the privacy of Americans is the drone and the use of the drone and the very few regulations that are on it today and the booming industry of commercial drone.
And then, you know, we can fast forward to basically 3 years later. We have a major morning news show covering a story on drones, as they often do now.
Growing concerns about drones invading our privacy. Anyone can buy one, and we're seeing more cases of people using them to spy on their neighbors. Very few states actually have laws to protect you from drones used for surveillance.
So, privacy is a huge conversation that's happening sort of simultaneous to the conversation that's happening about safety and FAA regulations and the regulations easing up. And just briefly, because we've already touched upon this with the two other speakers, I just want to show you a couple of images and explain a little bit about why privacy concerns are so strong here. Because the very same types of sensory enhancing technologies that Bruno's using on vegetation, people have the capacity to use, you know, on people and private places, private, you know, in quotes, right? So he talked about a variety of different devices. We could also add to that things like automated license plate readers that, you know, law enforcement might want to use, Wi-Fi sniffers, infrared night vision cameras, and thermal imaging, and a lot of different devices like that. And that, you know, essentially creates the possibility of collecting images and being able to do so with such precision. Now, this is just another recreational drone. We've seen a couple of pictures of them already. This is the Bebop drone. It's probably one of the best-selling recreational drones on the market right now. And it hovers and flies in all directions. It can stay aloft for probably like 22, 25 minutes, something like that. But it weighs under a pound. And people who are buying these drones are paying about $500, $600. These come equipped automatically with video streaming capability and cameras. And they're operated just with an iPhone or a tablet. And they're operated by 10-year-olds. You know, they're operated by 60-year-olds and whomever. I mean, these are very easy-to-use devices. The Bebop in particular has this fisheye lens camera, so it can capture an image. It presents a 180-degree field, and it also has an onboard data processor and an 8-gigabyte memory. But as the price increases, right, the technology increases, and for surveillance purposes, the government is developing and doing research on drones for purposes of surveillance that would essentially allow people to be unaware of the surveillance that's going on, because the drones themselves would just kind of blend into the environment. Now, there was a case, one of the first cases to kind of test how well existing privacy laws are responding to drone use, and that was in upstate New York. A man by the name of David Beesmer. Dave, are you familiar with this story? This was an interesting news story. So in upstate New York, this guy, Dave Beesmer, is a recreational drone user, and he takes something similar to the Bebop drone. He drops his mom off for a medical appointment at the Mid-Hudson Medical Facility. And he parks his car and he launches his drone from the parking lot of the medical facility. And the staff inside the medical facility looks out the windows and they see this thing like flying around outside the examination room. So they call the police. Beesmer gets arrested. In New York, he's charged with a crime called attempted unlawful surveillance. And he takes this case to trial, and it becomes a fairly big news story that goes outside of New York. He goes to trial, and he's actually acquitted. Now, in Beesmer's particular situation, the government in that case had to prove that Beesmer intended to see inside the medical facility through the windows via the use of the drone, right? But what's the problem there? If you can tell from this image, the windows are tinted, right? So the government can't persuade a jury that that was his intent. Hence, he's ultimately acquitted of this crime. But these are not stories that are uncommon these days. I mean, you're hard-pressed to go a week without seeing a news story, on just like the nightly news about drones flying around buildings and houses and backyards of people. This man called the police after he confronted a neighbor who was flying the drone outside the bedroom window of his teenage daughter. There are cases of people in high-rise buildings in major metropolitan areas, like a woman in Miami who basically looked out her window on like the 41st floor and saw a drone, like just hovering outside her window. She happened to be nursing her child at the time, so that in and of itself made a good news headline. But instances like these instances that are on the news all the time, and more people are having sort of their own experiences, either seeing or operating a drone, they really make us, I think about the relationship between privacy and technology. Technologies that are really at this point as ubiquitous as drones, and as maybe curious as Google Glass and other types of technologies that maybe you'll be talking a little bit about in terms of, what can we expect when it comes to privacy in the world in which we're living and in the direction that we're going, And specifically with drones, what constitutes a trespass of airspace? Because we essentially don't really have notions these days about owning airspace directly above our property, and yet we may be offended by that hovering drone that's, looking down on our pool parties that we're having, every Saturday night. And of course, we get into issues like this, like, what kind of measures can a person take legally to protect themselves, or at least to do away with drones that are hovering over them. And this man here in Kentucky, he shot down a drone that he claimed was flying too close to his property, spying on him and his family. And in Kentucky, his case went to court, and the judge dismissed his case, finding that in fact this drone was invading his privacy. And under Kentucky law, and I just want to repeat, under Kentucky law, found that he had a lawful right. He had a lawful right to shoot it down.
Now, who sued him in the first case? In this particular case?
Oh, well, actually, he was charged with a crime, for like unlawfully using, firing a gun. But he's also subject to, civil liability, where the drone owner could sue him. And I think in this case did sue him on the basis that he destroyed the person's property. Now, this person in New Jersey is perhaps not going to be as fortunate as the man in Kentucky. Again, it all kind of comes back to gun laws in different parts of the country. This man who shot down a drone in New Jersey, different set of laws. He's looking at a criminal mischief charge, an unlawful use of a firearm charge there, and kind of see how that plays out. But these cases essentially have us thinking about whether or not there are already existing laws in place that have the kind of necessary legislation to protect our basic privacy interests. And the question that I often like to ask people is, do you think that, or do you expect, or do you want there to be laws that are already in place that deal with the kinds of intrusions that are imposed by these aerial observers? Again, understanding that there are so many different kinds of applications here. So we're just talking and focusing here on the different, with respect to privacy. And the answer is often a resounding no. We don't think there are adequate laws, and if that's your opinion, you stand in good stead with basically the majority of lawmakers around the country, because right now we have, and these have basically started to have developed really in the last 3 years or so, states around the country proposing and enacting laws. So right now there are 25 states, right, depicted by this map, that where there is some kind of law with specific to drones. So it could be simply that it's directing government personnel to have to get a warrant before they use a drone for surveillance purposes, or in many states it may be essentially prohibiting people from using drones, private people from using drones without, and doing any kind of recording without written permission from those below. And then there are, and Michigan is one of these states that has these kind of hunting and fishing laws with respect to drones. Now in 2015 we had more than 35 states that had initiated laws just pertaining specifically to drones. And when we talk a little bit about language, lawmakers use the language drones. I mean, oftentimes in the bill itself, they'll talk about unmanned aerial vehicles, unmanned aircraft systems, they'll use the language, they'll give the definition. But by and large, the titles of this legislation involve the word drone, because people know what that is, right? Just into 2016, within 4 months, we've had, this is how many states just have new legislation. So not legislation that's moved from one session to another, but actually new bills that are being proposed. So it would be, I'd be minimizing it to say that lawmakers are, preoccupied with drone legislation. It is a huge issue right now around the country. This map shows you that there's 4 states right now that don't have any current legislation, either pending or enacted. And this map here I use because one of the things that I think has been interesting as I try to track the legislation around the country is to see the number of states that have moved away from just legislating government or public use of drones and have started moving more into focusing on private use of drones. So, in other words, this map 2 years ago, the states that are in the kind of maroon shading, those are states with enacted legislation with prohibitions on private users and how and whom and where they can use drones. Right? And I'm not talking about the federal regs now, I'm just talking about state laws. Well, we would have seen many fewer states in the yellow a couple of years ago. But what's happened now is that as these things have proliferated so rapidly, and many, many people now own and are using these things, lawmakers are now saying, well, we need to kind of either simultaneously or shift our focus here to not just regulating public use and focusing on law enforcement's use for surveillance purposes, but we really need to kind of constrain private use of drones because, again, the catalyst for all this legislation is privacy. So now we have 16 states in the country out of the 25 that have laws that are restricting private users, right? And that number has grown a lot. So just quickly in the time I have remaining, I want to mention just what do these laws look like? We talked a little bit about the paparazzi. Well, in California, this is a state that had the most recent drone legislation that was passed in 2015. This statute is known as the anti-paparazzi statute because what it does is it amends California's invasion of privacy statute so that if somebody's using a drone to fly over the property of, where I come from, we were obsessed with Tom Brady. So we'll talk about Tom Brady's 22,000 square foot, home in Southern California, and they want to kind of get images of him out there by his lagoon-shaped pool, or maybe Giselle, his wife, out by her lagoon-shaped pool, or throwing the ball around with the kids, and they fly the drone over to do that, right? To kind of capture those images. That would subject a person in California now to liability under the invasion of privacy statute. But prior to this law, because properties like that are nothing about his pool or those grounds are going to be visible at ground level. You're going to have to fly overhead. So that's what was sort of driving that particular piece of legislation. Not Tom Brady, but So, and then in Nevada, I'll just mention this because I think this is kind of interesting. This is a kind of a very different approach. Nevada has basically created a law, and this is enacted, where they've created like a column of airspace that a landowner has control over up to 250 feet above their property. So basically, in Nevada, up to 250 feet above your home or your land, you say, I'm refusing that you can travel in my airspace. And if you do so, that's going to be a trespass. Now, that law is in serious flux, given that the FAA is saying, no, we actually control all the airspace, so Nevada, your law is going to be preempted. That's another conversation. And I just want to mention Michigan since we're here. Michigan does have an enacted statute on hunting and fishing, which basically prohibits